Someone's trying to get it, but I don't know how to.
I'll come over. Is that seeing the video behind you?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we turn off some of the lights finally? Is that an option?
I don't know if we're able to do it the whole way.
Yeah.
Let me see what options are there. Hi, Robert. Welcome.
Yeah, that's
Hey.
wow.
You like that?
Okay.
Can you? We can still see them. You on the video, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And during the video portions, right? Would you mind just turning this
Ooh,
on
whoa. Yeah.
so that the videos can show more? It's just the one on the left that we're reading on.
We have multiple hybrid platforms going here. We've got Zoom, we've got folks in person here in the room, and then we're broadcasting live on my online ministry's Facebook page. So
Oh, cool.
There's
Well,
all
it's
these
like
lights right
2024 up in here.
I know.
Are you working on teleportation as well?
Yes,
Okay.
that's the next step.
Awesome.
Teleportation. Yes.
We need that so bad. Oh, variety is good.
Wow. Yes, thank you.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Is there anything with caffeine? Yes. Thank you so much.
Get started momentarily.
So this is obviously fan art of publication
Okay.
from the band groups.
Okay.
I actually got this push.
That's awesome.
And yeah.
Yeah, I want to see your presentation sometime too.
So we have a recording of it from the last one. And if you want to just give me your email, I can send it to you with the
Yeah.
password.
You want me to email you or?
If you want, did you sign in?
Yes.
If you want to just put video next to your sign in, I can, that way you don't have to write it
video
twice.
next month. Thank you.
And then I'll send you the video.
Yeah, the Macintosh up there. If you
Check
check
out
out
the music.
Okay,
Yep.
cool.
Thank you.
How have you been?
Good. It's good to see you again. It's been a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, looking forward to this. But yeah, I'd love to see that you did last month.
That's right. I'm supposed to have coffee with Pastor Aaron tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
So sometime in the afternoon, we'll see if I can schedule something for LOP too.
Yeah, I did appreciate it.
So I think we're 7:05, so I think it's good enough time to go.
Yeah.
Let me just start a recording here.
Sure. Okay.
Their older stuff is
Call Aaron and said, hey.
Okay.
not full on though.
Okay.
Let me just get rid of this.
Recording in progress.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thanks to those who are floating in the Zoom space right now, and also maybe watching the live broadcast. Like I said, more people are coming. Excellent. Hello. Yeah, so we are broadcasting this on multiple platforms. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Colin Amato, and I'm the clinical director here at Solano Pride Center. And the topic that we are going to be discussing tonight is addressing religious trauma. And I'm going to be talking about this topic from two combined perspectives. One as a licensed marriage and family therapist with a background in psychology as an undergrad, but also as an ordained minister. I went to seminary and received my master's in theological studies from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And I'm an ordained Swedenborgian minister, which is a very small, obscure Protestant denomination, very liberal and progressive. And if you've never heard of it before, that's okay. Most people have not. There's probably only about 2,000 of us in the United States. So I'll be talking about it from two different perspectives tonight. But I want to start with why I think this topic is very important, and it's a personal one for me. So I come at it as a professional, but also as somebody like millions of Americans, but also many LGBTQ plus folks who have dealt with religious trauma in their own life. I was raised as a Roman Catholic. I grew up in Solano County. I grew up in Benicia, and so I was raised as a Roman Catholic, but was exposed in high school and middle school to a number of very conservative Christian denominations that existed in the community. And the message that I received really early on in my life was that being gay, being queer, was unacceptable in the eyes of God. And so I had to struggle very early on in my life with this inner conflict, which I think many queer folks can relate to, which is the sense that we may have a spiritual drive within us, something that really propels us to seek meaning and purpose, and maybe even connect to a higher entity or being. And yet we're being told by outside influences that who we are, the core part of who we are, namely our gender identity, our sexual orientations, are unacceptable or a sin. And so that really caused me to question organized religion in general. And so when I was about 15 in high school, I embarked on what I consider to be a lifelong journey of studying comparative religion. And for me, it was in two reasons for it. One was just to understand other religions outside of Christianity, but also to understand how the various religious traditions actually handle or address the topic of gender variation and sexual variation. And so I began at the age of 15, and I'll be 35 this year. So this has been going on for quite some time for my life. And what it led for me was a journey through practicing different faith traditions. And this is something that we'll talk about when we go into more of the gritty detail about reactions that people have to religious trauma. But a very common experience is people might leave their faith tradition and then go on exploration of other ideas or philosophies. And so I certainly did that for myself. And for my own journey, I ended up kind of taking a pathway that people may find shocking. But in 2007, when I was a senior in high school, I decided to convert to Islam. And so I was a practicing Sunni Muslim for about 7 years of my life. I did that at the time because Islam at that time addressed a lot of my theological doubts that I had about Christianity. But when I converted, I didn't really have a sense of the various opinions that exist within Islam about homosexuality in particular, or gender variation and identity. And so, to my surprise, when I entered into college and began hanging out with Muslim friends of mine, I was met with a lot of opposition around the question of sexual identity or non-heteronormativity within Islam. And so it became very difficult for me because I essentially was living a double life, something that a lot of religious queer folks have to experience, especially in a conservative context, where by day, as it were, you are practicing the faith to the best of your ability, you're living that life, but by night, you are having to wrestle with this inner conflict of a disconnect between your core sexual identity and your religious identity. And needless to say, I dealt with that divide for about 7 years of my life. It was exhausting. And so finally I couldn't take it anymore, and I ended up coming out to many of my close friends, but I will say the way that I did it, I never came out officially like in the mosque, but I came out on Facebook. And the result of that, almost overnight, I lost touch with my community. There was a almost instant abandonment of the people that I had come to know and love over the course of about 7 or 8 years. I was no longer invited to community events. People in mass unfriended me from Facebook. And with the exception of about a handful of friends, people would no longer speak to me. It's not a unique experience. A lot of people in the queer community do experience this, and this is part of religious trauma, the fallout or loss of one's cherished community and support system. So I found myself really wandering without a religion for a few years, still feeling very spiritual, but not so much connected to a religious tradition, until my mom gave me some really interesting advice. She asked me if I had ever read this guy, Emanuel Swedenborg. And the reason why she asked me this is because I started to, I was majoring in psychology. I was planning to go to grad school to study counseling and psychotherapy at San Francisco State. And she recommended that I read some works by Swedenborg and also some psychologists that had been influenced by Swedenborg. And so I finally decided to read him, and it was, for me, a really healing process, because not only was it a version of Christianity that didn't come with a lot of the conservative baggage that I had been raised in, but it spoke to me as someone who was an aspiring mental health professional and also somebody who was interested in studying religion. And so when I discovered that there was a funky little church in El Cerrito that was Swedenborgian, I instantly started doing research around the denomination and the church itself. And I remember when I called the church to inquire about what would it be like if I went to a Sunday service, the person who answered the phone, who at the time was the administrative assistant, one of my clear questions was, what is your denomination's view on LGBTQ plus folks? And there was a slight pause on the other end of the phone and then some laughter, and the administrative assistant said, well, if there's a problem, they have a problem with me. And it turned out that she was an open bisexual individual. And so that was really refreshing to hear that it was an accepting group. And so I went, and I was very nervous. It was one of the first times in years that I had walked into a religious space. But it was very healing, because it was one of the first times in my life where I felt like I could not only have the spiritual part of me be alive and seen, but also being a gay man, that was also completely okay. So that division that I described earlier was starting to come together and be healed. So I want to share that. That's my story up to this point. So I share that because this is a very personal topic for me. So besides it being personal, what I've discovered in my experience as a mental health professional and also as a pastor is I've been blessed with the experience of working with the LGBTQ plus community early on in my professional career. So when I became an associate clinician, I was hired to work at the Rainbow Community Center, which is in Concord. And I was hired actually as a dual role. I was hired to be an associate clinician, but I was also in seminary at the time. And they were looking for pastoral interns, which I thought was really interesting, because you don't really see that marriage, right? Or that bridge between an LGBTQ plus center and then looking for active spiritual support. And so I applied, I was interviewed, and I was able to get in, and they hired me.
You fucking faggot, go kill yourself. You fucking stupid faggot. You're a faggot, you're a faggot, you're a faggot.
Who's saying this?
Get back, kill yourself, move on now. Move on now. Back. Like girls not dead. Like girls not dead.
Alright.
Is this somebody that came in on the?
Yeah, good date med.
Kill yourself, no, kill yourself. You fat
We may have to end.
Yeah, don't try to
we
mute
may
me
have
too.
to end
You're not
this.
kill yourself,
speaking,
no.
so they're doing.
Wow. Kill yourself, no.
You're a fag, you're a fag, you're a fag, you're a fag,
Yeah.
You ugly
From there.
fat bitch.
It's not
You
even
ugly
responding.
fucking fat bitch. I'm hacking your account right now, you fucking faggot.
Okay, we're gonna have to end this. I think we're gonna have to
Fucking
end.
asshole, I'm hacking your
You're not
End the meeting. End the meeting.
We proved the point.
Mr. Amato, I'm really sorry. That's
I'm sorry
wild.
too.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Well, let's continue.
So if
Okay.
we let people back in kind of selectively until something like that happens?
I think we may just have to, not have to deal with Zoom, I think,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
I'm afraid that's true.
Sorry for the others. But they could probably see the video after this, kind of.
We'll have it recorded on the Facebook,
Okay.
so we can still share it from here.
I got a question about that Swedish.
Yeah, please.
In the practice of worship, are they kind of Lutheran in orientation? Because I know Lutheranism is strong in Sweden.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so on the surface, it does look that way because Swedenborg was raised in the Lutheran church. His father was a bishop.
Yeah.
And so the reason why it's a distinct tradition is because he began to have his own mystical experiences when he was older. And so he began to feel like he was on his own sort of unique spiritual path that was different from mainline Protestantism.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So for you coming from a Catholic originally, and then it wasn't too far of a stretch to
Yeah.
go into Pentecostalism or something.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It is kind of unique among Protestant traditions because it's almost like Enlightenment mysticism. And, you know, he's definitely a product of the 18th century. So he sounds a lot like our founding fathers and kind of their worldview, but
Wow.
has a very scientific worldview, but also a very mystical worldview.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't hear that in marriage too often.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Do you have a recommendation of like where to start if you wanted to explore that?
Yeah, so I think one of his most famous works is actually called, it's a really interesting title, and there's some debate about whether it was originally supposed to be called this, but it's called Heaven and Hell, interesting enough, because he claimed to have had visions of the afterlife. And I'll say that it's unique because what I like usually my like kind of elevator pitch, not that we don't believe in trying to convert people. Like I said, there's only 2,000 Americans that identify with this tradition explicitly. So we're not really knocking on people's doors. Plus he wrote like 30 volumes of theological texts, so that's kind of a lot to carry around in a knapsack, right? So what my elevator pitch is like the things that may have really traumatized or felt very oppressive about like conservative Christianity, the Swedenborgian tradition is the exact opposite of that. That's my elevator pitch. So the idea that like there's a judgmental God that sends people to heaven or to hell, Swedenborg's theological view is that God is incapable of judgment. So we don't read the Bible literally. And the idea is that to get the afterlife, the destination of where we go in the next life is actually based on our own free will. So it's more of like how we live our lives in this life and how we continue to do so in the next. So we may end up in communities that might appear to be hellish, which have certain attributes, or heavenly, which have their own attributes. But it's based off of our own choice, our own destination, not God judging us or condemning us either which way. Just as one example, or a couple examples. Yeah.
Swedenborg is one of the few individuals that believes that if an individual is sent to hell, or say something that is an analog to hell, that is something that the individual decides upon themselves, right? Like,
Yes.
like this is atonement for what they've done in this life until they work through it to a certain extent to the next one, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a way of putting it for sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely like an ongoing process, for sure. But thank you for those questions, and for grounding me back in this. Was not expecting that to happen when we witnessed on Zoom. But I think it's all the more reason why we're doing this talk tonight.
I didn't know if that was like a plant illustration or something.
Yeah, I mean, very much so. So, and I'm not entirely sure who got the memo to do that, but that's cool. All right, well, let's shift gears a little bit. So, I'm going to be starting off with actually something really profound. One thing about religious trauma, even though we just experienced it now on Zoom, is that when it comes to like conscious awareness or conversation in our society, believe it or not, religious trauma as a point of academic study or discussion is new. New as in within the last 5 to 10 years. If you go to Google Scholar, you can do this right now if you like, and type in religious trauma, you'll notice the vast majority of the articles are pretty much not, they go back to about maybe 2017, maybe a little bit before that, all the way up to the most recent articles that I'll be quoting extensively tonight, which were published in 2022 and 2023. So think about that, okay? It's not that people haven't been trying to talk about this, it's just that there hasn't been extensive research, either from sociological departments or psychology departments. But what's interesting is that there was an NBC News article that I'm going to be reading from that was published in January of this year. And the topic is religious trauma still haunts millions of LGBTQ Americans. And the subtitle is some mental health experts are advocating for religious trauma to be considered an official disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM-5. I'm not going to read the whole thing, I just want to read the very beginning. Colin Swift, age 35, said he doesn't go on dates, struggles with erectile dysfunction, and is hesitant to trust people. For more than 20 years, he experienced intense bouts of anxiety and depression that have had a, quote, major hold on his life. Quote, imagine being told by everyone you trusted that you're going to hell because you like men. Swift, a marketing project manager living in Chicago, told NBC News. At just 11 years old, Swift recalled he would sit in his bedroom every night, praying or writing letters that said, please God, remove my affliction of same-sex attraction, and would then store each letter in an overflowing shoebox in his closet. Swift, who grew up in an evangelical Baptist church in rural Michigan, believed Bible verses like Matthew chapter 21, verse 22, quote, and whatever you ask in prayer you will receive, if you have faith, would help him pray the gay away. As he entered his teens and realized his feelings of same-sex attraction were only intensifying, Swift finally accepted that God would not be answering his prayers. Things went downhill from there, he said. Swift is among the 1 in 3 adults in the United States who have suffered from religious trauma at some point in their life, according to a 2023 study published in the Socio-Historical Examination of Religion and Ministry Journal. The same study suggests up to 1 in 5 U.S. adults currently suffer from major religious trauma symptoms. Okay, so I want to pause there for a moment. So this article that's cited in this particular news article is from 2023. And I pulled up a summary of that article because I think it's good to just get to the meat, plus I'm also an academic nerd, so maybe I'm going to quote some academic material here. But the article that they're referencing from 2023 is called Percentage of U.S. Adults Suffering from Religious Trauma, a Sociological Study. This research was funded from the Global Center of Religious Research. And I'd like to just read the introduction. That's all the summary has, is the introduction and conclusion. Really, when you're reading academic peer-reviewed papers, that's the most important part, is the introduction and the conclusion. You can skip all the rest of the statistical stuff unless you're into that sort of thing. But it says here in the introduction, leading into the 21st century, physician Martin Rossman noticed a disturbing trend among his patients. Many were suffering from the lifelong consequences of being raised in a toxic religious environment. He wrote, quote, a great number of people I see in my medical practice have been traumatized rather than uplifted by their religious training. I think that harmful religious training may be one of the greatest unrecognized causes of mental and physical illness in our culture, end quote. Although at the time he did not have a psychological or medical term for what he was witnessing, Rossman's experiential assessment and prediction about the pervasiveness of what is now understood to be religious trauma would turn out to be quite accurate. After compiling data for 1,581 adults living in the United States, this study confirmed what Rossman and thousands of other practitioners have observed for decades. Religious trauma is, in fact, a society-wide phenomenon, and spiritual abuse is a chronic problem within religious communities. So this is one of the first articles, peer-reviewed studies to be conducted and done just last year that demonstrates this. It also shows that, again, 27 to 33% of US adults have experienced religious trauma. So what is religious trauma in terms of definition? Religious trauma occurs when a person's religious experience is stressful, degrading, dangerous, abusive, or damaging. Traumatic religious experiences may harm or threaten to harm someone's physical, emotional, mental, sexual, or spiritual health and safety. This type of trauma often unfolds over several stages. A person experiences a trauma. So the person is directly negatively impacted by the religion itself, usually from a leader, someone in the family, or someone within the community. The trauma has religious implications. So the effects of the trauma are processed through the lens of the person's religion. And the response of the religious community may re-traumatize. So in other words, people are traumatized by an event, they go to seek comfort from their faith community, and yet are re-traumatized because instead of being supported as a result of the trauma, they're told, oh, this is probably your fault, or you need to pray harder, or you're going through this because God wants you to, or you're doing something that deserves punishment, or because of sin. Those are usually the three most common ways in which people experience trauma. There's also spiritual abuse, which is a little different. There's a distinction here. So abuse is the harm or mistreatment of another, often for the purpose of exerting power or control. So spiritual abuse occurs when a person, religion, or spirituality is used to exert control over another person. So, namely, the difference is that spiritual abuse is an interpersonal experience between two people. Often the abuser is a religious leader attempting to control or manipulate someone lower in the religious hierarchy, such as a volunteer, community member, or visitor. Maybe a parent using religion to abuse a child, or a spouse drawing on religious doctrine to assert their right to dominate or control their partner. And religious trauma is a systematic experience between a person and their religion as a whole. So what are some of the results? Well, what mental health professionals have been gathering through usually qualitative evidence, meaning in session with clients, are 10, these are sort of the 10 top symptoms of religious trauma. 1, self-hatred. So this may involve elevation of certain identities over others. So yes, okay, you're gay, but what's more important is that you're a Christian, and you need to submerge or suppress that other important part of who you are. Marginalization, discrimination, which may result in low self-esteem, depression, self-harm, or suicidal ideation. Shame is the second one. So it occurs when you equate negative actions with who you are as a person. So feeling that shame about who you are in the LGBTQ+ community, the shame of one's orientation or gender identity. The third is perfectionism. Some religious communities may identify certain actions or behaviors as indicative of a person's moral value. So they may promote certain careers or types of families as spiritually superior. This can result in perfectionism, which is often accompanied by high levels of anxiety and stress, as well as a setting of unrealistic goals and expectations. 4, hypervigilance. 5, difficulty making decisions, life events. 6, the loss of community, like I mentioned earlier. 7, the lack of boundaries, so not really maintaining healthy interpersonal boundaries. 8, delayed social milestones. 9, sexual dysfunction. And 10, a whole host of other mental disorders that are co-occurring, like of course PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, eating disorders, addiction, depression, and anxiety. And a lot of therapists now are recommending, of course, cognitive behavioral therapy, or just having interpersonal psychodynamic therapy is helping with this trauma. So I'll pause there for a moment. I know this is pretty heavy. How are we doing so far? We doing all right? Okay. So like I said, there was that study. And trust me, before we end tonight, I will be talking about the hopeful aspect of this topic, the healing aspect of this topic. The other really important article that I want to mention, I think this is a really, really good one to be aware of. The title of the article is called "The Impact of Religious Trauma on the LGBTQ plus Community, a Systematic Review." This was actually the doctoral dissertation for now Dr. Miranda Goodwin, who has a doctorate in social work from the School of Social Work at the University of Alabama. Okay. This was published in 2022, so she successfully defended her dissertation. And I mention this because, again, this was published in 2022. She received her doctorate just last year. The timing is that that other research article that I mentioned was published last year. So again, this is cutting edge peer review material that we're talking about. And so what's important about this is that Dr. Goodwin was able to look at similar research to that other article that determined that 1 out of 3 Americans suffer from religious trauma, and she did a deeper dive with the same material, looking at, okay, so 1 out of 3 Americans suffer from religious trauma, but she wanted to look at LGBTQ plus people specifically in her research. So what she did is she actually did a literature review of 383 articles that had the themes of religious abuse or trauma, maybe on their own, and also the spiritual religious experiences of LGBTQ plus folks, and basically took those, combined them together, and out of the 383 articles identified and screened, there were 17 out of the 383 that matched the criteria of this overlap that we're talking about right now. So with that literature review, she came to some really interesting conclusions.
It's like a meta study almost.
Yes, absolutely. The first meta study of its kind ever done. Okay, just done last year.
I hope she was a speed reader.
What's that?
I hope she was a speed reader.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so just, I'm not, again, this is pretty extensive. The entire dissertation itself is 81 pages. I'm not going to read all of that, but I'm going to highlight some of the conclusions and some of the things she says in her introduction and background. So this is what she says in her introduction. Individuals identifying as members of the LGBTQ plus community are subject to higher rates of discrimination and oppression than cisgender individuals. According to the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress, common forms of trauma among LGBTQ plus individuals include parental rejection, bullying, physical and sexual harassment, and hate crimes. This in turn leads to the higher rates of mental illness due to increased exposure to trauma and adverse experiences. This is partly due to societal stigma and prejudice, which can include religious practices and cultures. Although there is a lack of literature studying the impact of religious culture on trauma in the LGBTQ plus community, there are multiple studies that examine the relationship among sexual identity, orientation, and trauma experiences. So, she's looking at the intersectionality of sexual minority identity and the impact that negative religious experiences within the community has had on mental health outcomes. What she discovered in the literature review is that the U.S. Census Bureau found that approximately 8% of adults ages 18 through 25 openly identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual and further estimated that another 2% identify as a sexual orientation other than just LGB or heterosexual. That was according to 2021 U.S. Census Bureau. As a demographic, 48% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer adults reported being religiously unaffiliated, 48%. However, 51% of LGBTQ individuals did report a religious affiliation, with 42% of these individuals identifying as Christian, 27%, Protestant, 14%, Catholic, and 1% as some other Christian faith. LGBTQ youths are less likely than LGBTQ adults to ascribe to a religious affiliation, and LGBT adults in the South of the United States, 57%, are more likely than LGBTQ adults in the Northeast, 41%, to identify as religious. Lesbian individuals were more likely to ascribe importance to faith, 50%, followed by bisexual persons, 40% overall, 42% bisexual women, and lastly, gay men at 39%. That's according to the Pew Research Center in 2021. Just some interesting numbers, right? Not an even split, but a split amongst the community in terms of whether they identify with a religious affiliation or they don't. The LGBTQ plus community has long represented a source of conflict as some within the Christian community who, in many doctrines, view same-sex behavior and cross-gender identification as expressions of immorality and a departure from biblical and Christian values. Research also indicates that 33% of religious LGBTQ adults experience conflict between their beliefs and their sexual orientations. While mainstream LGBTQ plus culture may not always be a safe place for queer people of faith, conservative branches of the church have been experienced as places that may contribute to distress, so much so that jettisoning one's faith may be viewed as an adaptive choice when faced with the tension and minority stress found in balancing faith and sexual minority identities. However, many sexual minorities choose to retain their faith identities, affiliations, and practices, even in these more conventionally religious spaces. Despite a growing literature on the experiences of sexual minority Christians, limited research appears to focus on the damage inflicted in religious settings, on the emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being of these individuals, and the hardiness of this demographic to stay committed to their faith despite the struggle they may internally feel. One more thing I want to quote from this particular article that she mentions a little later on is there was an interesting Pew Review Center survey that was done in 2013 where they surveyed 1,197 individuals who identified as LGBTQ+, and they were asked to rank the following religious groups on a scale of if they're unfriendly towards the LGBTQ plus community. And these were the results. Islam was at the top. 84% voted that it was the most unfriendly, followed by the Mormon Church at 83%. The Catholic Church was at 79%. Evangelical Christians at 73%. Jewish at 47%, and non-evangelical Christians, so the rest of Christianity, at 44%, respectively. No other religions made it on the poll, okay? So I found that just striking, right? That they were asked to do this ranking, and that was the outcome of the results. Things are shifting. What they discovered is that when they did this study again, there was some impact or difference in the numbering based on same-sex marriage policies found within the religions and also at the national level. One thing that this article mentions is that a lot of the abuse that can happen that leads to traumatic experiences is similar to the cycle of abuse that's mentioned in other forms of trauma. The article says, this is similar to the cycle of abuse within a domestic violence relationship. The cycle of abuse includes the tension building phase, explosion phase, and then the honeymoon and recommitment phase. A particular research article explains that within religious abuse cycles, the tension building phase includes a decreased tolerance for not learning or applying religious teachings, increased rule following that is expected, decreased explanations for why things are done, so just chalking up to the higher power, the way scripture is interpreted, or the faith in the religious leader. Focus on decreased reasoning and logic, so thinking for oneself, decreased sense of self, and villainizing critical thinking skills, what to think, how to think. The tension building phase also includes increased submission to authority and increase to shame and self-blame when religious protocols are not followed. Increased requirements of compliance with the group and an increased dependence on external authorities, which can lead to a decreased sense of self and increased self-doubt. The same research article states that the tension builds, an individual will inevitably experience an explosion. This is a period in when the stress overflows. Some examples may include punishment for sins or behavior, threats of excommunication, removal from the religious group or system, or public humiliation, forcing individuals to take responsibility for abuse inflicted upon them. This can also include physical and or sexual violence. Following the explosion phase, the reconciliation phase includes a period of the person of authority repenting for the acts that were taken against the individual. There may be repentance on both parts and apologies for abusive behavior. There can also be placating statements and promises of restoration of relationships, as well as a focus on the positive aspect of the relationship. There's also a strong focus on recommitment to the belief that the religious establishment knows what is best, and then finally, it continues and cycles through. So I'll pause there for a moment with this article in particular. So I want to highlight this because, again, I think it's really important that not only is religious trauma being addressed in academic research, but that the queer community is now having its due focus on the negative impact that religion has had. So, as I promised, what are some of the hopeful aspects to this conversation? I think what I was trying to get to earlier before we were Zoom bombed there, excuse me, I've had the privilege of working with folks, both in the capacity as like a pastoral intern, but also as a clinician in training, and finally as a licensed clinician. And in my experience, I would have clients early on in my career where some would come to me because they had experienced religious trauma explicitly, and that was the focus. I would have clients where religion and spirituality was never even really mentioned during the course of the work, and then suddenly, as the relationship was building, it would inevitably come up. And then I had a third category where it was kind of half and half, where the focus was on mental health, but then religion may be brought up as well. So I never knew exactly where it was going to occur, but it was almost inevitable that religion or spirituality was brought up in the course of my work with my clients. So that told me that even though, even though in the queer community we've suffered this abuse, and we don't have a lot of representation in many organized religions, that thirst for spirituality and growth, and also the search for meaning and purpose, is a human experience. It's something that we in the queer community definitely value, and something that we participate in. And so the way that I would help people, and the way that I see as being recommended by these therapy articles that I discovered that were published, again, just this year, is that listening to the client, hearing the story of the trauma and negative experiences is how the healing begins. Witnessing, actually hearing the pain and the suffering, that's the first step. What I've discovered with my clients is that some, when they talk about religion or spirituality, there's a percentage of them that want nothing to do with organized religion at all. Absolutely nothing. They may identify as atheist, agnostic, spiritual, but not religious, but they're not going to walk into a church, probably, maybe ever, or maybe, it's going to take them a long time, but they are on the outs with organized religion. I've had some clients that are lucky enough for them at least, to identify or belong to an open and affirming church or synagogue, And so they participate in organized religion, but they are not fed the bigoted fundamentalist message that a lot of conservative forms of religion participate in. And so for them, their religious identity is not at odds with their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And then finally, there's a category of clients I've worked with, which I call the questers, which are folks that have the sense of spirituality and search for meaning, but they recognize that the organized religion they were brought up in or exposed to did not work for them. And so they embark on a quest to discover spirituality or religion that helps support who they are holistically as an entire human being. They don't have to walk into a space and wonder, do I have to leave that part of me at the door? No, the entire part of them can be authentically experienced simultaneously. And that, I think, is probably one of the most healing experiences. I know it was for me, and the feedback I've received from clients of my own is that that's true for them. And so as a clinician and as a pastor, I don't pretend to know where an individual journey is going to go. I'm there to facilitate a safe space for this type of conversation. And even if a client of mine, like a team that I work with that I spoke to a few weeks ago, who never talks about religion, finally looked at my card here at Solana Pride Center. They noticed like the letters, a series of letters after my name, and they saw MTS. And this young teen asked me, like, what does MTS mean? I said, that's a Master's in Theological Studies. And this is somebody I've been working with for a few years now. They never knew, surprise, surprise, that I studied theology or was a minister, because I usually don't like begin conversations like that in this space in particular. But they noticed that for the first time, and it opened up this whole conversation around just being able to ask questions about religion. And it wasn't so much like that they identified with the religion, but just having that safe space to ask the hard questions. Like, is there really a God? Maybe is there an afterlife? What's the difference between being a Catholic and being a Protestant? I got the sense from this client that these were questions they had been wanting to ask, but didn't have a safe space to do it. So even if I'm doing like psychoeducation, as it's called, or teaching, I just like being a facilitator for conversation, for the healing process. I hope my clients benefit from that. Where it comes up also within our community, I find, is with our seniors, our elders in the community. Even if they've been traumatized by religion, it's inevitable in their advanced age that they're going to start asking questions about the meaning of life, and especially life after death. Because it seems to me like even if they've abandoned organized religion or they're not that spiritual, that question, because of their advanced age, is going to inevitably come up. And so I create a space where we can just talk about, like, so you were raised to believe that heaven and hell are like this, and I invite them to ask the question, what do you think the afterlife is going to be like? So I empower them to use their own, what I call spiritual imagination, to maybe envision what their hopes and dreams are for loved ones they've lost, where they're at now, and where they would like to see themselves after death.
And that's a feminist move. A feminist, womanist, sacred imagination is very much a part of the womanist, black feminist experience.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's powerful, and it's amazing to hear the different examples that I've heard from clients who've answered that question for themselves. And it's powerful because it comes from within themselves, right? It's not something that someone else is telling them, this is how it's going to be. They've determined it, and it's very powerful. So I think I'll pause there. I thought that I would probably only talk for about an hour. I've been talking for, that's kind of funny. I almost treat this like it was a therapy session. This tells you what I do most of the week. We're about at 50 minutes. So I'm going to pause here for right now and just open it up to see if there's any questions or any reflections at this point that anybody might want to share.
Well, just based on what you were just talking about, there's something about stepping away from organized religion where, like you were saying, people are telling you how to think, that almost seems to unlock a personal connection to the divine. But then, like, there's no one to share that with, to get validation. And that is what I think losing the community has or never even having it, has been the hardest part for me. Is like, because when you talk about your connection to God, but you're not part of a religious community, the other people that have either turned away from it or they're maybe atheists, they're like looking at you funny. So, but then you start talking about the people that are in faith communities but don't accept your identity, then they don't want to have that conversation open with you. It's almost like it's ruining their sacredness by exploring their own sacred communication with the divine. So, I don't know. I can't even say that I've sat and thought about that. It just is what triggered in my mind when you said that.
Yeah. Thank you.
So well, and you and Will know that, but I really do think that the more of this type of program we can bring to our community, the more healing that can be done. So we can have that safe, brave, shared space to explore this very human aspect of who we are.
Yeah.
It's just something I've never been able to turn off, no matter how much I want to. So I appreciate the bravery of both of you doing these presentations, and just thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah. I think it's very much needed, and I think that the opportunity to do it is pretty rare. I get a lot of what I've experienced, like knee-jerk reactions in a lot of queer spaces that I go to, like outside of the center, just like social spaces that I go to, where I mention like, oh yeah, I've studied religion, and like the immediate knee-jerk reaction a lot of the time is very negative.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, why would you ever do that? Like, as a queer person, like, what's the point of that?
Yeah.
And what that tells me is that, again, as the research would suggest, a lot of people have been injured and a lot of people are in pain. And so I don't blame them for having that reaction, but I think there's a lot of room for healing and for growth.
Colin, what would you say to a denomination who's trying to figure out what their stance should be today to address the trauma in their own pews?
I think I would say that to a denomination like that if the purpose of the church is to establish community and to establish a space where people can come together and be themselves in worship, that they need to practice what they preach, which is, if it's a Christian denomination, what Christ says, one of the greatest commandments is to love one another. And I think if you're causing pain to people, that's not love. So I would ask them very politely to practice what they say they believe in, first and foremost, and to care about the people in their community, and that means everyone. That's where I would start.
Yeah, I know in my Presbyterian history, but I've been a member of multiple denominations. Freedom of conscience is also an issue that they lift pretty highly. And that works great when everyone's in the loving feeling, but not when folks haven't moved from the hate to the love. And how to help someone come along, making space for folks in our community and their community can be among the hardest things, especially if they feel threatened by that, but without binding their conscience.
Yeah,
That's a hard one too.
that is.
And much of what you said when you work with your clients is what they also have to do is just to be quiet and listen. And I think that that's with any marginalized group. Our first inclination is to tell them, oh, it's okay, we do love you, it's better than it was, but really you have to hear the pain and suffering first before you can start to fix.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the hardest part about being a clinician, and it's the hardest part about being a human, is just to be quiet. And so I think that would be an addendum, an addition to what needs to be done. It's not just putting a rainbow flag out front.
What about those people outside the LGBTQI community who maybe wounded by an authoritarian type pastor or somebody who basically, you know, God told me to do this, or God told me. I know a case. I don't know the person personally. I know his brother. And this guy was a pastor whose wife had passed away, and he was in the sanctuary praying, and a young lady walked in, and he turned to the young lady and said, "God just told me that you're supposed to marry me," and she did. You know, and I mean that's. I don't. I mean,
That sounds like
maybe
spiritual.
God did, but it just really, it almost seemed like an abuse of power. You know, in a sense. I mean, this is the pastor of the church. You know what I'm saying? And I don't think that young lady was walking in the sanctuary with the expectation that she'd be told, "You have to marry me," kind of stuff. But I mean, that's, you know, it could be abusive, and I know other situations where, you know, choir or minister of music plays that same role with that person that joins the choir. They say, "Hey, you know, I love you, and you know, I think it's God's will you marry me," and she ends up marrying him, and then she feels resentful, you know, about that, you know, and you know, 11 years and 2 kids later, she wants out of the marriage, you know, and feels wounded and thinking, you know, I don't even know if I could trust God if I basically entered into this relationship, believing it was God's will, just because this person told me. And that person was in an authoritative role in the church, you know, the worship leader, music minister. That's abuse too. That's trauma too, you know. And people healing from that, you hate to see them just walk away from the faith because they lose trust in God too.
Yeah. And it depends, I think, on that person's individual, you know, journey, whether they completely leave it or they come back. But I think like the word really stands out to me from your story, and I appreciate you sharing that, as authoritarian, or the authority, because a particular, he was a sociologist but also a psychoanalyst. His name was Eric Fromm, and he wrote a book in response to trying to, he was Jewish, and he was trying to understand or wrestle with the question psychologically how the Nazis were able to do what they did during World War II on a societal and psychological level. The book is called Escape from Freedom. And so the idea is that he came to the conclusion that a lot of humans suffer from a fear of individual free will, because it's very difficult to live as an individual and go through life
But
trying to
regrets the decisions you made out of your own free will.
Right. And so instead of like leading your own path, you fixate on an authority figure, hence escape from freedom.
You have someone to blame.
Yeah. And so he translated that not only when it comes to like societal or political movements, but he talks about it in a religious context too. So he makes a distinction between the appeal or the attractiveness and the abuse that happens in authoritarian forms of religion. And he compares that to what he calls humanistic forms of religion. And the difference is that an authoritarian religion starts with the power being from the top down, right? Whereas a humanistic approach to religion starts with the individual people. So it starts here and goes upward towards a divine or transcendental realm, right? That's at least his theory. So it's like an antidote to the authoritarian is empowering individuals to make their own decisions, whether it comes to their religious beliefs or their own spiritual practices. So, but he does say that sometimes when people are so disillusioned by the authority, they have to exit. But their exit may not be permanent. If they can figure out what works for them as an individual, as a religious or spiritual person, they might be able to reconnect with a community or with a social group and be okay because they've done their own inner work for themselves, their own individual work. So I just offer that as an
So from a
example.
therapeutic standpoint, how do you help them with that individual work?
I encourage them to ask the really tough questions about like what is it that they actually believe. I encourage them to look beyond maybe the indoctrination or the dogma that they've been force-fed. And I even encourage folks to do what I did, which is if one flavor of religion didn't work for you, the good news is there's a lot of other flavors of religion out there that you can experience, right? And so a lot of queer folks that I meet may identify as a liberal Christian, but a lot identify as Buddhist. A lot of them identify as Taoist, and there's a growing popularity with the revival of neo-pagan, Wiccan, and Satanist groups that are queer queer people identify and participate in. And so if a client comes to me and says, yeah, I was raised as X, Y, and Z, but now I feel really comfortable identifying as Satanist, I go, awesome. If that works for you, then good for you. They're living a spiritual life. They feel really good about themselves. I encourage it. It may be controversial to say, but I got my degree from a school in Berkeley, so.
You're the second person I know with a degree from there.
Awesome.
Maybe the third.
Any other thoughts or questions?
I mean, I guess it's another reflection based on, I don't know your name, sir.
Oh, Andrew?
Hi, Andrew, I'm Stefan.
Hey, Stephanie.
What you were saying about religious trauma and the two examples you gave were women that were kind of forced into marriage by this authority figure. And I think that probably if the DSW that wrote that paper had looked at women in religious trauma in the United States, she would have found a lot more than 17 articles. And, you know, that is, you know, we keep getting more and more documentaries about these women that, you know, escape into nothingness and lose their entire families, whether it's Scientology or LDS. And it goes deep.
Or other, what they're now calling high demand religions. I grew up a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints of Mormon in Salt Lake City. And back when I remember it being called a cult. And there were certain things in the group that made it earn that reputation. Not all of that is part of it today. It's made some changes, but it still has a patriarchal authoritarian structure that if you ever say anything bad against the brethren, you're excommunicated. So, yeah, high authoritarian groups tend towards this as a part of their subculture, sadly. And I was only able to escape it when I saw one of my neighbors amongst 7 others excommunicated. And
For what?
yeah, for writing about beliefs that they had that were based on LDS beliefs, but were somewhat esoteric or feminist.
Wow.
And that was in the 90s. So things have changed quite a bit there, but there is a mass amount of folks that have left, including my niece, who left because they wouldn't give her the priesthood. And she was a part of the folks asking for females to get the priesthood. And her husband has been her biggest champion and supporter, even though in that culture it's not easy, even as a spouse, to support your spouse if they're having issues with the doctrines. So it depends on how much control each group has too.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that with a lot of the churches, you know, losing, I don't know how many people in my generation are going to church at all, if any. And I think that that's, you know, kind of kept going. If they did do it where, like you were saying, a humanistic approach where they spread, what do y'all think? Let's talk about this. Let's have a more educational instead of me standing up here and telling you what to think. I think that would change a lot. But it would take generations to heal. It wouldn't be an overnight thing.
No, yeah, certainly.
That's even hard in some traditions that elevate the freedom of conscience.
Absolutely.
Soul freedom was, you know, or still is, the basis for a lot of Baptist traditions. But they've been clamping down on anyone who thinks differently than the mainstream, and even defrocking women who'd been ordained for 30 years.
And that's why we keep doing what we do.
That's right. We keep doing what we do. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all so much again for coming tonight, for enduring this topic with me. And, hopefully it's some food for thought. And, hopefully it inspires you in your own journeys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marlette shared fascinating.